So in our last video, we talked about the distinguishing features of academic genres, and one of them was vocabulary. And it's not just vocabulary or nomenclature in the sense of certain words exist in certain fields and nowhere else outside of that field. That's part of it. So for example, linguists have certain words that only linguists use, like morphophonemics or prosodic phonology and things like that. Biologists use words like adenosine triphosphate. Don't worry about what I'm talking about, it's not important. Physicists talk about quarks and leptons. Don't worry if you don't know what those are. Those are terms that are unique to specific fields. But also, we need to talk about another aspect of nomenclature, which is how a number of words which can be used in general English have very special, unique, different meanings in certain academic fields. So please refer to section 9.4 in the book, and there are some words for you to discuss, or I'll put them on the screen for you here. I want you to discuss with each other, think about these and discuss with each other. What do these words mean in general English, and what do they mean in particular academic fields? Because they have different meanings in general English versus academic English. So these are some words that have different meanings in colloquial or general English versus academic English, and it could be just general academic English or particular fields. Sometimes maybe two or more different academic fields where they have different meanings. So some of these are maybe commonly used in science, social sciences, maybe psychology, literature studies, linguistics, etc. How do these words mean different things? So in other words, what do they mean in general or colloquial English? Again, colloquial is informal conversational English versus academic English, especially in particular academic fields. How are they different? I want you to pause the video and discuss this for a while. Okay, let's take the first one, research. A lot of times I hear people say, oh, I did some research on this. Did they really do research? I do real academic research, and so that really bothers me when people say that. Because what do they mean? They went to Google, they did a Google search, they went to Wikipedia. It's not research. Well, not to me. And sometimes they mean it to say, I went on the internet and I found some sources that agree with my opinion. Nonsense. I want to say, did you conduct your own experiment? Did you do your own statistical analysis? Did you compare two groups and statistically compare them, huh? Did you submit your findings to an academic journal? Okay, that kind of bugs me, but I know that's people just mean they looked up information and maybe they tried to find some good sources, but you don't know. Because a lot of people don't know how to distinguish good sources on the internet from bad ones. And they'll maybe gravitate to stuff that they agree with. Or they'll end up on some sites that are not credible or reputable, and they get fooled by utter nonsense because there's so much nonsense on the internet. Research for us means we actually do, and this varies a lot from field to field, but we follow some kind of really formal procedures for doing research. It could be an experiment, and there are very formal, specific procedures for doing a laboratory experiment, for example, or collecting data of some kind and doing a formal research study. Or even if it's just sitting in your chair doing literary analysis or historical analysis, there are formal procedures that are used for doing that. And you have to be properly trained in those procedures, in the research methodology and the framework and how people think and the theories of the field to do real research. Statistics. What are statistics? To the average person, it's what? Averages, counts, frequencies, percentages. That's what we call descriptive statistics because it only describes things. In academic research, like in psychology and in science fields, that is not really what we call statistics, except descriptive statistics. It doesn't really tell you if anything is really happening necessarily. You could look at two different groups and look at percentages and counts. It doesn't tell you if there's really anything interesting happening. We have to do experiments and do statistics that are used for comparing two groups or comparing two ideas at least. The idea that there's nothing interesting here or something is happening here, my hypothesis. And there are specific statistical procedures that are used to do this, what we call inferential statistics, for inferring if something really is happening, because frequencies and percentages don't tell you if something is really happening. Percentages and frequencies can fool you, or they can be manipulated in order to fool you. There's a great classic book you should read if you want to know more, How to Lie with Statistics. It was written a long time ago. It's a classic. You should read it, and the author is not trying to tell you how to do it, but he's trying to educate us about how, for example, advertisers and politicians or less credible sources will manipulate statistics in order to lie to the public. And the descriptive statistics like counts and frequencies and percentages, that can be easily manipulated. Real inferential statistics can't really be manipulated as easily. And many times if you do try it, you'll get caught. Correlation. What's correlation? To the average person, it's just like a connection, a relationship of some kind. There's a correlation between the amount of food that I eat and the weight that I gain. Okay. But in statistics and academic research, it's a specific type of statistical relationship. If X goes up, Y goes up a certain amount, and you can graph it, you can chart it. It's a specific mathematical relationship. And there are certain statistical procedures that are used in order to do this, to look at this. I'm not going to bore you with statistics. I happen to like it. I happen to like statistics. I found it very valuable for my research, and that's why I like it. But a lot of people are scared by it. Shouldn't be. Let's move on. Gravity and mass. I put them together. A lot of people think these are kind of the same thing. Not exactly. So a lot of people think of gravity as, this. Things fall. To a scientist, to a physicist, that's not exactly gravity. That's gravity on Earth. It doesn't work like that in other places necessarily. Gravity in physics is a specific attractive force. It's defined by the law of gravity. It's a specific force by which two objects are attracted to each other. The Earth is attracted to the Sun, and also the Sun is attracted a tiny bit to the Earth, just a tiny bit because the Sun is so much bigger, but that's how gravity actually works. It's a mutually attractive force between two objects. It's a force. It's defined in a certain way. To scientists, they think of gravity in terms of the gravitational formula, particular weight, mass. You think of mass as stuff, matter, weight, same thing. Mass and weight are the same thing. Again, on Earth, yeah, but not to a physicist. You have a different weight on Earth than you do on the Moon or on Mars, but you have the same mass. So mass is kind of the same thing wherever you are. And a physicist would define mass in a very technical, special way. It's defined as the ability of an object to resist acceleration due to a force being applied to it. Yeah, sounds really complicated, but that's how they define it. So if I apply a certain force to an object, up to a certain point it resists a certain amount of force because it has a certain amount of mass. So the ability to resist accelerating or moving when a force is applied to it. That's how they define mass in physics. It's complicated, it's very different, but that's how they define it. Moving on to psychology, self-esteem. What is self-esteem? you probably think of it as how you feel about yourself. And that's true generally, in the general sense. Now in psychology though, they will have a very specialized definition of self-esteem. It's defined in more technical terms as how you evaluate yourself according to certain criteria. And some criteria are more important than others. How you evaluate yourself according to general criteria and according to maybe some specific criteria that are important to you as well. So it's actually a fairly complex kind of idea in psychology. It's a lot more complex than you realize. And it's connected to some other things like, well, confidence, self-confidence. It kind of overlaps with self-esteem, but self-esteem is more about kind of evaluation and also comparison, how you evaluate yourself and compare yourself to other people too. Happiness, what is happiness? Well, I think happiness is feeling good, yeah. I'm happy that I got an A in the class, sure. In psychology, happiness, there's a particular field of area of psychology where they study happiness, and this is not some kind of pop psychology. For decades, psychologists studied depression and what makes people depressed over a long period of time. And then some psychologists realized, oh, wouldn't it be also cool to study happiness? And here they're defining happiness in terms of a long-term mental state, not just how you feel at a moment. Like, oh, you got the A on the test and you feel good right now. How you feel over a longer period of time. Are you generally happy? Kind of satisfaction. Are you happy with your life? Are you happy with your status? There's an area of psychology called positive psychology, not to be confused with some pop psychology misuses of the term, but positive psychology is a study of what makes people feel satisfied with their lives over time. The general overall emotional state over time, not just one moment, but over time. That's happiness. Move on to literature and linguistics. Metaphor. What is metaphor? Well, if you took literature classes and you learned about figurative language, you learned about metaphor as a type of device. It's a particular kind of figurative device, and it's different from simile. Simile was like she radiant as 10 suns or something like that. But metaphor is a more direct statement of something figurative. A metaphor is more of a direct, figurative, comparative statement. It's defined in a very certain way in literary theory. And that's metaphor. And they distinguish different kinds of figurative language. Metaphor, simile, metonymy, and other kinds of particular devices. So there's a special definition in literature that's a little bit different from the way maybe people define it colloquially. Now in linguistics, metaphor, there's a particular area of linguistics called cognitive linguistics, which also uses metaphor in a special way, which is kind of different from the way literature people use it. So metaphor would be kinds of non-literal use of language. So for example, you say, I'm going up to Seoul. Well, what is up? You don't mean literally up, but kind of up on a map. It's kind of metaphorical to a linguist. You may not think of it that way, but to a linguist it's kind of metaphorical. Prices have gone up. So you don't mean literally physically up, but up in kind of a metaphorical sense of kind of like something increasing in volume. And it kind of goes up like that in a visible way. It's a metaphor. It's a linguistic metaphor. What does it mean when you get over an illness? Over, it's kind of a metaphor where the over has a sense of completion and recovery. It's a certain kind of metaphor. So there's an area of linguistics where we study this kind of metaphor. And it's different from the way that metaphor is discussed in literary studies and literary theory. What is narrative? Well, in literature, narrative is a particular genre, kind of storytelling genre, or it's a particular technique, storytelling technique or storytelling genre, kind of a historical or storytelling genre or technique or method. In psychology, it's a kind of conceptual framework that kind of defines, for example, who you are and your identity. You could maybe tell me your life story and key events in your life that define who you are and what changed you. That's kind of your narrative, and it's not just your life story, but it's also includes things like your identity and things that shaped your identity and how you think of yourself. And it's somewhat used in a similar way in political science. For example, you talk about, this politician is selling people on a particular narrative of what it means to be an American or a Canadian. That is a particular way of telling the story of the history of the country and how that shapes your identity, you, the average citizen, what it means to be an American, what it means to be British. That's a particular kind of political, cultural narrative. So political science and sociology might use narrative in that sense too. Myth, another literature term, literature and related fields. And it's not just a story that isn't true, but more importantly, it's a story that's shared by a group of people that says something about their origins. Think about the Tangan myth in Korean culture, or the biblical myth of creation, the creation story, or the two different creation stories in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. That's a myth, not, and the focus of that meaning in technically is not that isn't true, but it's kind of a founding story, a story of origins, tells where a certain people came from, or it explains things about the world. So myth is designed to explain how we came to be, how the world came to be, or how we as a nation came to be. And of course it's composed of fictional elements, but its purpose is to explain something about your identity or your origins. Who are we as a people? Where did we come from? That's a myth. Why do things exist? So the second biblical creation myth about Adam and Eve in the garden, it's designed to explain things about men and women, about evil, the nature of evil in the world, things like that. So it's explaining something. Okay, those are just a few examples. Words that have specialized meanings in different academic fields. Because the things that you have to be sensitive to if you're an academic. And if you're communicating with the public about your field, for example, if you're an academic person and you're talking to the public, sometimes you have to be careful in defining your terms or explain your terms carefully, because you've maybe been in the field for a while and you've kind of absorbed the meaning, the mental framework. This is what we mean when we say this, but the general public may not understand that, and you have to be careful when we try to explain maybe certain ideas. And it could be you as a business person. If you work in a company and you absorb business terminology and thinking, and you try to talk to non-business people like the public about your company or your work, again, you could have communication breakdowns because they don't know how you're using certain specialized words. Let's talk about linguistics. What do you think a linguist means when we say a language? Or when we talk about language? When we talk about language, what is language? What is human language? Is it the same as a computer language? Is it comparable to animal communication? What do linguists think of as language? And what is a language? So what is a language like German and French and English and Dutch? And is it easy to divide them? Is there a clear dividing line between languages? What makes a language? Or what makes a language versus a dialect? Pause the video and discuss these for a while. And we're back. I'm going to briefly explain these two terms. You could spend a whole class. I don't want to spend a whole semester explaining these terms to you. different linguists maybe have different theories. They follow different theories, and so they'll probably define these terms a little bit differently, especially the first one, language. We would generally agree, though, in any field of linguistics, any type of linguistics, that human language is not the same as animal communication. A famous linguist named Firth once said, "Your dog can tell you that he's hungry now, but he can't tell you that he was hungry last night," or something like that. There are a lot of important properties of human language that are different from animal communication, and also a lot of important structural properties that distinguish human language completely from a computer language. Computer language like C and C++ and Java and Python and such. I won't go into all of it here. We don't have time. But regardless of what kind of linguistics you do, we pretty much recognize that human language is very special. It's actually, there's a huge gap between human language and any kind of animal communication. We study primates and we see some basic elements of language in their brains that they can sort of do if trained, but there's still a huge gap. And so human language is very different from animal communication, and it's very different in its structure and its usage from computer languages. It's a very special thing. And I won't go into it here, but take a linguistics class. What is a language? For example, a language versus a dialect. Is it easy to define? If you know about Chinese, you know that there is Chinese, but then there are lots of dialects. And many of them are not mutually intelligible. If a speaker of one dialect cannot communicate with another. Where do you draw the line? It's actually very difficult. In fact, linguists actually usually speak of about 4 or 5 different Chinese languages. And each of those has many dialects. There's like Northern Chinese or Mandarin, there's Minnan, and there's Hakka or Kejia, and so on. Think about German and Dutch, and also the German spoken in Switzerland. You know, I spent a year in Germany. I speak German. I can't understand people from Switzerland. It's supposedly German. I can't understand them. A lot of Germans can't understand them. The Swiss identify culturally as German, at least the Swiss people who speak Swiss German. They culturally identify as German, and they call it German. It could qualify as a different language, but for cultural and political reasons, they identify that as German. In Germany, you're like, what? Can't understand you. If you speak standard German, it's hard to communicate with people in Holland, Dutch speakers. I've never studied Dutch formally, but I can kind of read a Dutch newspaper because it's kind of similar to German in many ways, and it's also got a lot of words borrowed from French and English. But there are people who speak certain German dialects near the border, and they could go from the border inside Germany across the border into Holland and talk to people right on the other side of the border, even though it's supposedly 2 different languages. It's sort of like this continuum. So where do you draw the line? It's kind of arbitrary, and there are so many other cases like that between languages. A language is defined not just in terms of can 2 people understand each other, mutual intelligibility, but also political and cultural factors too. So this is culturally, politically, this is Dutch, this is German. And in Belgium, northern Belgium, this is Flemish. Even though it's Dutch, it's Flemish. It's because it's a different country. It's complicated. So sometimes linguists will maybe debate technical definitions of some of these terms. What's a language versus a dialect? These are just examples of technical vocabulary and how these things mean something differently. Between general English, you think of a language, well, an average person would just think, oh, English, French, German. The reality on the ground is much more complicated than that, but it's a reality that only linguists know about. What is language? It's a hard one. It's going to depend on the particular linguistic theory that you follow. You can define language in philosophical, logical terms. You could define it in terms of social and cultural aspects, or in cognitive aspects, psychological aspects. There are different ways of defining language. Different linguists will define it a little bit differently, or they'll focus on different things depending on what kind of theory they follow. And something you have to be aware of if you're going to be a linguist. Next on the agenda, some important academic vocabulary. We're going to get into maybe in the next video segment. Terms like theory, law, model, and hypothesis. And these are often misunderstood. In my country, we have a common problem of people not believing in the theory of evolution. They say, oh, it's just a theory. They think because it's called a theory, that means it's not been proven yet, or I don't have to believe it. And they think, well, if a theory is not proven, but if it's proven, it becomes a law. Is that right? We'll talk about that in the next video segment, because these are important concepts we need to know about academic English, and for the genre analysis unit, and just to be an intelligent citizen in life in this modern world. So until then, I'll see you later.